Hello and welcome to my UAV research series here at the Aerospace Village. I'm Matthew Gaffney, also known as Cyber Gaffers, and this is episode 4 where we're going to talk about regulations. Really important topic, one we're going to go straight into. So we're going to cover a few things today. We're going to obviously talk about why regulations exist. Some people really don't understand that, and we'll talk about two key areas. We're going to talk about USA, obviously governed by the rules of the FAA, and then talk about the UK CAA and some of the exciting stuff going on in the drone space here. And I've got the CAA to agree to an interview, and that's really interesting, and it's so refreshing to see the regulator coming up with pragmatic ways of controlling and regulating the airspace in a way that's so permissive to recreational and commercial users. And we're going to hear directly from them as to why and how they went around that, and a bit of history as well. And then we'll wrap up at the end. So why do regulations exist? Well, it should be fairly straightforward, to understand this, but some people don't. The key thing really is to avoid unacceptable risk to the public and other airspace users. This isn't 1905. This isn't Wright brothers flying around in the airspace without anyone else around them that they have to be wary of. So we have to be aware of other air users. We have to interact in a way that is defined and that is safe. And avoids the confrontation with those air users and the public as well, because if something goes wrong, every flight owes a landing, and hopefully it's a safe and legal landing. If not, then it poses a risk to the public, because you can crash on people, you can crash on buildings, and that's just not acceptable at all. And like I said, it's also to protect vulnerable and critical infrastructure. We have power stations, military installations. All these things are very vulnerable to attacks, and also vulnerable to accidental incidents as well, where drones and other aircraft could fall on them. And we'll see why drones can be such a risk later on. Because under the CAA, you're allowed to fly a drone that's up to 25 kilograms. That's over 50 pounds. That's huge. And the amount of damage that can do to a building is actually not insignificant. So the regulations, they provide a permissive framework where the drones can be used, and they ultimately enable their use, because rather than ban drones because some people find them annoying, it's not a hobby that has a real functional purpose, like, for example, cycling, where you can use it to commute to work or go to the shops, go see your friends. With drones, it's really, you're only flying because you like flying drones. It's not like you are performing as a hobbyist. You're not performing any kind of work or moving things left from one place to another. Otherwise, you'd be a commercial operator. You wouldn't be a hobbyist anymore. So the regulations there, they enable their use, and so we have to make sure that by following them, we're also enabling the hobby to carry on in the future. So it really is important to understand and abide by the regulations, however tempting it may be to take your drone above the flight limits and out of line of sight without the correct authorizations. Yes, it's fun, but it's not safe. So we'll start with the USA. So there's some key things with the USA. I mean, the USA and UK aren't massively different, but they are. The fundamental difference is that the FAA makes a distinction between recreational, certified and commercial, police or government, and educational users. And while 3 of those categories kind of use the same rules, they have different opportunities open to them, and the waivers kind of work slightly differently. And then the certified and commercial, that comes under a different thing altogether. But essentially, the Bible for USA, for the FAA, is the Part 107. And that covers all the drones, the drones regulations. So in the USA, all drones require registration. No ifs, no buts. You have to, register your drone. And there is a training and testing program called Trust. It stands for something. And that's coming soon, but it isn't in place yet in the USA. I think it's going to come in online later this year, which is great. But as well as the FAA regulations, there are also local and state laws that can apply too. I know for a fact that there are a number of videos I've seen online where people are flying their drones, and they're coming into conflict with local laws and state laws, which have been applied a bit like bylaws here in the UK. So those are also a bit of a maze, and I can't really cover all of them because there's probably so many. But if you're flying in the USA, make sure not only do you understand the FAA rules, but also get a hold of your local and state laws and see what applies to drones. Ultimately, though, the FAA has developed an app that you can use. So it's called Before You Fly. And you can basically look at an area and see what restrictions they know are in place. It might not have everything. Like I said, local and state laws, there are probably so many, and some are hidden in, statutes and things like that that are kind of hidden away. So, they might not have everything in the app, but it's a really good starting place, So it's definitely going to have all of the kind of the federal restrictions on airspaces, the flight restriction zones and all that kind of stuff around aerodromes. It's going to have the military and government restrictions, and I believe if you want to fly over Washington DC, forget it. It is basically a no-fly zone for drones. But that's all on the app. Download it, get your nose in it, and it's a really, really good tool. So like I said, so for recreational flying, it's 14 CFR of Part 107. You're allowed to fly a drone that's up to 55 pounds in weight. So that's not quite, in fact, that is 25 kilos, more or less exactly. But the key thing of recreational flying is you must not be remunerated for the flight at all. So if even expenses, so if you're flying a drone, it has to be under recreational flying, you have to be a hobbyist. If you are, for example, taking some photos for a friend and, they slip you a few dollars as a favor, that's not right. That's actually, you come under a commercial operator at that point, and you should have full certification under Part 107. So be very careful with that. Why not just turn those dollars into beer and have that as a gift rather than just for being a good neighbor, rather than directly in return for the drone stuff. I'm not sure if that's 100% legal in the eyes of the US law. I'm not an expert in that. But what I'm saying is, do not get paid for your hobby flights, because you would not fall under 14 CFR Part 107. You are then come under a commercial operator, and the rules are very different. One of the key things is visual line of sight only. The FAA doesn't define what, well, not in 107 any, they don't define what visual line of sight is. But as we'll see later, the CAA define it as 500 meters, which is essentially gives you a kilometer, space in which you can fly, which is quite big, as long as you can still see the drone as well. You must give way to all other traffic, which is all of the air traffic, which is quite which goes without saying really, and you must fly below 400 feet. Now in the USA, I think this is where it gets a bit interesting, because we have here in the UK the same rule, 400 feet or 120 meters. And that's because the lower end of the open air space for general aviation is 500 feet and above. So you've got that 100 feet buffer zone between two. However, in the States, we don't have this in the UK. We don't have crop dusters here in the UK, so it's not an issue. But in the USA, you do. And I understand that some crop dusters, don't necessarily get above that 500 feet at all. They're supposed to be above 500 feet when flying to and from the fields they're dusting, or between fields. And then once they get over the field, they're allowed to go lower. But I understand that not all of them do. So, if you are flying in an area where you have a lot of agriculture and you either know or see crop dusting aircraft going about, be wary of that. You might be flying legally and below 400 feet, but a crop duster could just pop up from behind some trees without you knowing, and all of a sudden you're in conflict. One of the rules they state in the Part 107 is you must not interfere with emergency services or law enforcement. Now, I understand there are also protections under under the Constitution and what have you, which kind of give you some freedom of movement in that area, but I'm not going to go into those. That's for you to research and understand. But 107 clearly states, do not interfere with emergency services or law enforcement. It does not say that you cannot fly near an incident where there are emergency services, but just stay out of conflict. Unless you have an absolute reason you have to do it, I would just not bother. Another rule they say is not to fly over people at all. So I'm not sure how they can fully enforce that rule with it being there, because let's say you're flying within the 500 meters. Let's say you've still got visual line of sight of your aircraft. How do you know that 300 meters away you have a space that's devoid of people? If it's behind some trees, you can still see the drone, it's above the trees, but behind the trees there are people and you can't see them. So I'm not sure how enforceable that is. It's probably going to happen by accident and not through the drone pilot being malicious or doing it deliberately. In which case, are they still breaking the regulations? I don't know. One of the key differences here is that under the FAA rules, daylight only. Now, if you're a recreational flyer and you want to do anything different from that, you can apply for a waiver. You have to go through the FAA. Part 107 gives you all the documentation and the procedures you have to follow. But if you want to deviate from those rules, you need a waiver. Okay, so it's very clear cut, it's open to recreational flyers. It's not like we'll dangle a carrot and then we'll always say no. No, it is open to you guys to apply for a waiver and be able to fly. So commercial or certified remote operators. So here it's, like I said, it's governed by Part 107, and you have to get, the pilot has to be certified, and you can do that from the age of 16. You'll need an FTN or FAA tracking number, and you have to do a pass the knowledge test. And from what I understand, it's quite involved. You can't just turn up and take the test. You have to go through, you have to do some learning, you have to learn about rules of the air, you have to learn about navigation, you have to learn about vectors and all that kind of stuff. And it is actually quite involved. So if you do want to go down that route, by all means, get your nose in the buck and start learning, because you will need it. It's not a simple take test that you can just go through. I'm sure some people have found it easy and might disagree with my assessment, but from what I've heard from speaking to people, it's not just a turn up on the day and just go through it. And of course, you also have to register your drone. For commercial operations, you're going to be working in an official capacity. Your drone must be registered. Now, interestingly, in terms of freedom of movement, there's not much difference between what you can do as a recreational flyer or a certified flyer. The only difference being is, a commercial or certified remote operator can be paid for operating their drones. That's the really only difference. Now, if you want to deviate from that, you have to get a waiver again. So if you want to operate at night, you want to operate from a moving vehicle, over people, beyond visual line of sight, you'll need a waiver from the FAA, regardless of whether you're commercial or hobbyist. And also, I think there are some tests going on with beyond visual line of sight flights or extended visual line of sight, where they have spotters out and on the route, and they are all in communication with the pilot. But I don't believe that there's any true beyond visual line of sight, waivers being granted at the moment that are not part of tests that the FAA are doing right now. So I think they're very reluctant to give those out right now. But that might change in the future. I certainly hope it does. And then we have the police and government operations. Again, it's under 14 CFR of Part 107, same as a recreational flyer. However, you're able to fly as a public aircraft. And that gives you access to waivers for emergency authorizations responding to natural disasters and emergency situations. So in the event of a wildfire or a hurricane, actually under Part 107, you're not allowed to fly, But if you're a police and government, then you can have access to a waiver either on a case-by-case basis or a pre-approved waiver that says, actually, yeah, you're a fire department, you need to fly a drone around to look at hot spots on the ground so you can direct your resources in a safe and effective manner to fight that fire. When a fire is going on and it's been labeled a natural disaster, you can fly, you don't need to call us. So that's the difference there. Again, though, it's under 14 CFR, so same restrictions as though you were a recreational flyer, which is quite interesting. And then educational users. So essentially, this is for people to, for schools and educational establishments to use drones as part of their their teaching resources. But you come into conflict with the remuneration rules. So this is a waiver basically that says you can fly as a recreational flyer, but you're a teacher and we recognize you're a teacher, and so we're going to let you be paid as a teacher, not paid to to do jobs as a for inspecting things as a drone pilot, but to be paid as a teacher whilst using a drone. So that's what this part is allowing you to do. And like I said earlier, that there are movements in this area. So they've got some advanced operations coming on, which are really interesting. So I spoke in episode 1, I believe it was, about Zipline, who are doing work in Africa. They're actually based in San Francisco. It's a startup based in San Francisco. And they have been doing package deliveries for medical supplies, COVID tests, and what have you, PPE, within the parameters of a study and a test with FAA authorization to do this. So they've been learning in Africa, perfecting the technology, perfecting the processes, and then bringing that back to America, where they can use it to effectively deliver healthcare in remote places, cost effectively, without putting people at risk, without moving people around and moving the the virus around, and it's really having a positive impact. So obviously, these operators don't just want it for medical purposes. In the future, I believe Amazon are working on one. DHL are definitely working on a drone to deliver packages. It's going to come. But these are advanced operations, and but they are all covered by this Part 107. Not 14 CFR. They're allowed. Advanced operations are allowed specific, operating parameters. And there's also emergency operations which are being looked at as well. So firefighting, search and rescue. I mean, search and rescue is great. Normally, it would require a helicopter to fly around with a very expensive, infrared camera. But if you could do that with a drone, the camera is going to cost more than the drone. But all of a sudden you don't have to put flight crew at risk in order to search for people on the ground who might be hurt or in danger. So yeah, it's certainly a force multiplier, because you can, instead of one helicopter, you can have, off the price of a helicopter, you could probably operate I don't know, maybe 4 towards 10 drones. So you increase the area you can fly and search for people. There's also an area which is quite interesting from a military perspective as well. A friend of mine, he's in the Royal Engineers, the British Army. He works in like geospatial intelligence, which you may say, what the heck is that? I had to have it explained to me. But essentially, what he's doing is studying the ground, studying buildings, studying infrastructure, and what it means to the battle space. But not just the battle space, but also for humanitarian operations where the military might get involved. So say, for example, you have a partial collapse of a building. You want to get the engineers in there to assess whether it's safe to go in and start, recovering people. But are you putting those engineers at risk by doing so? Well, what about sticking a drone in there instead with a very accurate LiDAR sensor on it, fly that through the structure, and all of a sudden you have a very accurate 3D model of the building, so you can see where whether the building is going to collapse. You can see where the danger areas are. You can see where the possible areas where people might be trapped. Yeah, it's a really interesting space. One that's getting looked at quite a lot, kind of on the side, out of the view of the public at the moment. Okay, moving on to the UK. So over here we have a framework known as CAP 722, which has been in place for a while, but it got through a recent update. So applicable from the 31st December last year, there's a new framework that essentially looks towards the future. So it looks at what we've got right now, it looks at the future, and it's a really interesting take on how they do it. So a lot of the key parameters are very similar to the USA with the FAA rules on Part 107. Things like registration and permit requirements, mandatory training, registration of drones. But the key thing for the UK is that they are classifying drones based on their size, weight, whether they've got a camera or not. And that's ultimately based on risk. And the operations as well are based on risk. And there's no difference between commercial and recreational operations. So the same rules apply. I mean, thinking back to Part 107, essentially the same rules apply to everyone unless you're on, on the special operations side. Everybody else was operating under the same rules with slight tweaks here and there, which is kind of a bit confusing, because essentially you're all having to follow the same rules. There's no difference here, but I think what the CAA is doing is saying, there's no real, difference between a commercial and recreational drone pilot anymore. The operations you're undertaking is based on risk, So, whether you're a drone or whether you're a hobbyist, if you are doing a certain category of flight, these are the rules. If you want to do anything else, you need to get, authorization, do a risk assessment. And it's a really interesting way of looking at it, and it's really exciting for the future. There are some downsides to it. I'm going to cover those in a minute. Certainly when it comes to legacy drones. But I think on the whole, it is a positive step forward, and it is a really exciting space to be in right now here in the UK. I think the key thing as well is that, and I thought that before these changes, recreational drone pilots were not able to get approvals for operations outside of the normal regulations. So if I wanted to fly beyond visual line of sight, I couldn't do it because I wasn't a commercial operator. Apparently that was false. But what these new regulations make clear is that it is open to the hobbyist now, but it describes the steps you have to go through. And it also comes with a cost, but we'll talk about that later on in the interview. In the UK as well, obviously there are, when it comes to looking where you want to fly, not many of us here in the UK have large gardens. I think a lot of places in the States, you know, it's quite typical to find half an acre, even more of a garden. Not very common over here in the UK. We don't have as much land, you know, so you have to know, you know, the laws and the bylaws here. Some of these bylaws are quite old, and they've been updated to include drones. You know, so you know, in some places you've got bylaws which have remained untouched for, you know, 20, 30, 40 years, and all of a sudden drones come along and they're like, oh, we have to update. You know, so a lot of public spaces here in the UK actually restrict the use of drones, and this is where it gets a bit funny as well, because so places like, you know, the National Trust, which is essentially a charity which holds in trust a number of historical buildings and gardens and sites in the UK, and it's a really, really beautiful, you know, setting. I remember myself, I go and see, you know, Churchill's old house, for example, is in a National Trust, and there's massive gardens that were done by Capability Brown, beautiful. You know, but National Trust says you're not allowed to fly on our land, mate. However, when it comes to the UK, and it's the same in the States as well, as, you know, you don't own the airspace above your house. You know, if an aircraft, you know, with a pilot on board flies above your house, you can't turn around and say, oi, you know, you're not allowed to do that. You know, you don't own the airspace, and it's the same with drones. But if you want to take off and land from their land, then they're allowed to control that. So this is where it gets a little bit fluid, you know. So while you're allowed to fly over their land, you're not allowed to land or take off from their land. So you have to find another way around it. And this is where right of way and right to roam laws come in very useful here. So right to roam is in Scotland. You know, it's actually more gives more freedom to the public than here in the UK. Sorry, here in England and Wales. So in Scotland, the right to roam is, you know, large open spaces of land owned by landowners. People are allowed to walk wherever they like. You know, so often think about, you know, some of the Highlands and the Ben Nevis and things like that. These are all covered by right to roam. So, you know, there's you know, nothing stopping you probably from flying drones there, as long as you abide with the rest of the rules within Cap 722. In the rest of England and Wales, what we have are rights of way, public rights of way. Some of these are footpaths which have lasted for hundreds of years. They go back to historical routes that workers used to take to work in farms or work in towns. And some of them are, you know, what are known as, you know, bridleways. I'll come to those in a minute. But they basically, nobody's allowed to stop you from using a public right of way. And technically speaking, and I've had this checked out, you are allowed to launch a drone from a public right of way. Now, where it gets a bit funny is if there are people on that public right of way, well, Cap 722 comes into effect. So, you know, you have to, you know, so you can't do it from a road, you can't do it from a pavement or sidewalk, as you would call it in America. You know, that's not allowed because there is a reasonable expectation that there's going to be people on that road or on that pavement. But if you're on a footpath in the middle of a field, and you can see that there's nobody on that footpath, then, you know, it's probably, you know, in fact it is actually okay to operate your drone from there. Now, obviously you can't camp out on these rights of way; they are for movement only. You know, so you launch your drone and you go back, you know, to open space, and then you can fly your drone. And also in the UK, you know, anything you're allowed to do under Cap 722 is overridden by privacy laws. So, whereas I can fly my drone over somebody's garden, if they have if they're out in their garden, they have an expectation of privacy because they're in their own house. So I can't fly a drone right up to someone's house and look inside the windows. That would be a breach of privacy laws. But if I'm flying around and I capture people in an open space on a camera, that's not a breach of privacy laws. But they do come into effect. And then I talk about the Computer Misuse Act because obviously, starting in the next episode, we're going to start doing some funky stuff with drones. So, I'm going to start learning how to hack the drone. I'm going to do some, some RF monitoring, some hacking and what have you. But there are things I have to stay, I won't be able to do because I have to stay within the bounds of the law, such as the Computer Misuse Act. So I'm not allowed to hack someone else's network. I'm not allowed to hack other people's drones. I've got to stick to my own drone. I've got to stick to my own, my own IT. That's why I mentioned the Computer Misuse Act. And yes, so I say new regulations. It's already been in place for a while. It's just been an updated version, and so it covers all all UAVs, all drones, recreational and commercial, and the categories are based on risk. And when I talked about earlier, there's a downside to it. It's this transition period here. So old drones won't have the new categories that have been assigned by the CAA. So they're bringing in a transition period. What we're going to find is that some drones, although they're tiny and have little risk, have to be only flown in the open category. But I'll come on to those in a minute. So the operating principles of CAP 722, just like on Part 107, visual line of sight only, 400 feet above the ground, 120 meters for those in metric. And buildings do not automatically give you extra height. There are certain structures which allow you to fly, I think an extra 25 meters above and then 30 meters around, I think it is. The onus is on you to make sure that you can see and keep control of your UAS. So you're not allowed to fly, outside of that, outside of those parameters. And the visual line of sight principle ensures that the pilot can maintain the key requirement of any flight, and that is to avoid collisions. So, and the regulations are very clear that while corrective lenses like these can be used, visual aids such as binoculars and telescopes are not allowed. First-person view cameras can be used, but only if you have a second person stood next to you who is doing the job of looking out for hazards. So if you're on your own, you cannot use your goggles to fly the aircraft, and it does not satisfy, the visual line of sight regulations. So you can't use, even with a spotter, you cannot use an FPV camera to go beyond visual line of sight of where you're operating from. If you do want to do that, you need to get special authorization from the CAA. And to do that, you will have to basically prove one of the following three things. Either a technical capability which is accepted as being equivalent to the ability of a manned pilot being able to see and avoid. And it's also known as a detect and avoid capability. Now, this is, for me, this is like ringing alarm bells off, because this is a technical capability equivalent of the pilot being able to see and avoid. That to me sounds like it's going to have to go through some kind of certification, and that starts getting very expensive. The CAA, they are a public body, but they are they are self-funded. They don't get much, if any, money from the government. They get their money from charging for certifications at airlines and other things. So for me, when it says accepted as being equivalent to, that's like, whoa, that's going to cost you a lot of money. So another option is to find a block of airspace to operate in, which manned aircraft are not allowed to fly in. And this would reasonably allow unmanned aircraft to operate without the risk of collision with other aircraft. Now, what that's saying is essentially you're looking at areas where model flying clubs is a good example, but generally those are not big enough to be beyond visual line of sight. You can't go to a military base where aircraft aren't allowed to fly over and say, well, I'm in an airspace where aircraft can't go, therefore I'm allowed to do it. No, because that's restricted airspace. So you're not allowed to do that either. I'm not sure how many of these blocks of airspaces there are in the UK. If any pilots out there know, let me know, because I'd like to find one and do some, and get authorization to do some visual, beyond visual line of sight stuff myself, because I want to try it. But again, I'm not 100% sure that, this is, this is beyond the realms of the possible, unless you were to apply to the CAA to basically segregate in a block of airspace yourself, and that would require a NOTAM going out and other checks as well. And again, that's going to cost you, because that's going to involve quite a bit of work on behalf of the CAA. And then the final option open to you is clear evidence that the intended operation will pose no aviation threat, and that the safety of persons and objects on the ground have been properly addressed. Now, that sounds to me like risk assessment. So this is where it starts getting subjective and possibly objective. So, and this is looking at, again, it's going to cost you money, but maybe not as much, because basically what we have to do is go, well, if I'm flying beyond visual line of sight, what are the risks? And, so you look at, who the threats could impact on, what the impacts are, the likelihood, and then go through your mitigation strategy of reducing that down to the lowest possible level. And and a key phrase I see a lot in CAA documentation is where the risk is reduced to a reasonably acceptable level. So they're not looking for zero risk, because let's face it, we work in InfoSec, we know that zero risk doesn't exist, but you've got to get the risk down to an acceptable level. But they're going to decide what that acceptable level is, really. So you need to get inside their heads. You need to, have that conversation, and not just launch into it without, launch into it blind without talking to them first. So have that conversation with them. They're really open. They're really, they're really approachable, and they're willing to talk and advise you, through the process. An interesting thing under Cap 722 is that operations at night are allowed, but your basic visual line of sight principles still apply. So even though you might have lights on your drone, which mean that it can be seen for 3 miles away, that does not mean that you can fly 3 miles away. You're still limited to that 500 meters. But again, only 500 meters if you can still see your drone and control it without without problem. So which way it is, which way up it is, which way it's facing, which way it's going, and if you can do that, then yes, you're allowed to fly at night. But you must, you must apply for operational authorizations for this. So you can't just go and do it, but you can get operational authorization for it. But it sounds like something quite simple to get authorization for, because they basically say, basic visual line of sight principles still apply, but for operational authorization, specific nighttime considerations must be addressed, such as daylight reconnaissance of the site and a safety assessment, identification of potential hazards, illumination of the launch site, aircraft lighting, weather limitations. So they kind of lay it out to you, saying, okay, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. If you're going to do nighttime operations, come and speak to us, have these things looked at, and, it will be a fairly easy process, he says. Altitude. So, no flying above 400 feet or 120 meters. And the main reason for that is that the majority of manned aircraft operate at 500 feet or above, like I said earlier. There are occasions where you'll have police, fire, and military aircraft that need to fly lower. I mean, where I live, I get Chinooks flying over my house, and I'm pretty sure they're below 500 feet. So if I was to fly anywhere near my house, I can't, because I'm inside a couple of FRZs. But if I was, I would constantly have to be on the lookout for these Chinooks, because I'd have to either land or go really low when they're flying over. And like I said, it should also be noted that buildings don't give you extra height automatically. So structures taller than 105 meters can be overflown by a maximum of 15 meters, not 25, 15, so long as the owner of the obstacle has requested it. And it must be flown no more than 50 meters horizontally away from it. And so the intent of this exception is to allow for drones to be used for inspecting things like wind turbines and power cable pylons. That's really what it's about, because I think in that space, if you're trying to flying a fixed wing, you'd have to be a very talented pilot to be able to do that and not stray outside of those boundaries. So for example, my drone, the Believer, it flies at 20 meters per second. So 50 meters horizontally gives me 100 meters around, and then I've got to be away from the blades as well. It's just a few seconds and I'm already past it. It's just not really possible. If it was a quadcopter or something like that, then yes, that's different. That can hover, that can stay in one place, it can move around a little bit here and there. So that's really what it's intended for. And if you're flying a sailplane or a glider, you can go above the regulated 400 feet above the ground, provided you don't go 400 feet above the pilot. So essentially, what they're saying is, we understand that gliders without a motor are often flown off of ridges. So you'll, as soon as you throw it, you're in breach of regulations because the ground falls away. And what they're saying is they're not going to penalise you for that. But they do say don't go 400 feet above where the pilot is, and you're okay. Again, it's based on risk, so it's very sensible. Avoidance of other aircraft. So CAP 722 points out that when flying a visual line of sight, remote pilots should approach their task with a mindset that they will be the ones required to take avoiding action in the air. And this is particularly important when operating close to helicopter routes or features which may be used by manned aircraft for navigation, such as major roads and rivers. So helicopters may also land at unlicensed landing sites, which won't be marked on any maps, and they might also be loitering at low altitudes. Due to their small size, drones can be difficult to see against the backdrop of that is presented to a manned pilot. So yeah, the onus is on you to get out of the way. And as well as these considerations, the regulation puts a specific requirement on drones piloting in open and specific categories to avoid any risk of collision with any manned aircraft. And to discontinue a flight when not doing so would pose a risk to other aircraft, people, animals, or property. So I was actually going to fly my drone a few weeks ago, and I'd identified a spot on the map where it said I had, a public footpath, and I had open space, and I had the required space away from buildings and people. I checked, there wasn't many people around, and when there was, I just waited for them to go past and be out of the way. But the spot where I wanted to fly, I noticed some deer, and they could see me. I was several hundred meters away, but they were looking right at me. So I knew that if I flew my drone, I would have been, basically disturbing those animals, and that would have been against the rules. So I went, half a kilometer down the track to another spot, which was just as good, and there was no deer around either. So, and the protection of third parties, and that's splits people into two main categories: the involved and uninvolved persons. However, this mainly defines the distance from which an unmanned aircraft can fly away from them. It does not absolve the pilot from their responsibilities towards their safety. In all situations, the pilot must fly defensively and with the expectation that control of the drone can be lost at any time. So you also have to ensure that the aircraft is in a safe condition to fly. You don't fly at speed close to people, so no dive bombing, and consideration of environmental factors that could affect safety. So if it's gusty, for example, and you're flying close to people, just remember that a gust of wind can knock an aircraft off course before you have time to react. If you're close to people, that puts them at risk. So uninvolved persons are those people not directly involved in the US operation. So this covers, for example, spectators at a concert, people on the beach, in a park, walking on the street, or a footpath, or those who are solely present for the purpose of only those who are solely present. I'll do that again. Only those who are solely present for the purpose of participating in the drone operation, or who have given their explicit consent to the remote pilot to be a part of it, are considered involved persons. And this is important because it governs how close you are allowed to fly to them, and depending on the category of your drone as well, and we'll come on to that later. So when making a decision as to whether it is permissible to fly close to people, the 1-in-1 rule has been defined to quickly determine the safe distance allowed. And basically, if you are flying at a height of 50 meters, you cannot fly closer than 50 horizontal meters to uninvolved persons. The reason being is that higher you are, the further a drone can travel if you lose control. So the separation distance must be increased to reduce the risk. And we'll cover this in more detail when we discuss the operation categories. Where you have assemblies of people, and this is large numbers, the consequences or impact from losing control could be significant. CAP 722 addresses this by placing an objectives criterion on the term assemblies of people. It doesn't leave the interpretation to chance. So it is not, but that's, it's not defined by numbers. Instead, it evaluates qualitative. It is not defined by numbers. Instead, it evaluates qualitatively based on the ability of those within that group to escape from any risk posed by the UAS operation. Examples of assemblies could be things like sporting events, beaches on a sunny day, parks, shopping streets during commercial hours, sporting venues, music festivals, the list goes on. Vehicles, vessels, and structures are not specifically defined in CAP 722, although the rules of the Air Navigation Order, Article 241, still apply, and it is an offence to endanger such property with an unmanned aircraft. CAP 722 does make it clear, however, that the separation rules still apply to vehicles, vessels, and structures unless the pilot can be certain that they are unoccupied or that the people inside are still protected. So as a rule of thumb, you should probably assume that every building is occupied and treat it as so, because if it is a house with a garden, then there is a reasonable assumption that someone could be in their garden. If it was a building that was completely enclosed with no garden and you were flying on the opposite side of the entrance, you could consider those people to be protected and maybe reduce the separation distance. However, this is likely subjective, and if you are reported to the CAA, you would have to be able to show that you have taken the correct steps, you've considered the risk, and you've applied the regulations as they stand. So going on to the categories of operation, the main one is the open category, and this is the one that is the most permissive. You don't need authorization to fly it, and it is open to recreational and commercial operators without specific authorizations. And they make a key definition in that these are for low risk operations to third parties, and they are based on basic predefined limitations. And like I said, they don't require authorization, and they are, simple to understand, and deliberately so. However, your maximum takeoff weight is 25 kilos, and like I said, it's visual line of sight only, and no higher than 120 meters or 400 feet. Any deviation from that, you go into the specific category, which I'll talk on in a minute. The open category has 3 subsections, and these are defined on the size of the drone and the risk they pose to people. So in A1, you're allowed to fly over people, but only with those UAS that pose a very small risk of harm to people. And these are drones that are considered small toys. So think to my, my small little trainer aircraft, that's 248 grams. This would be able to, this is allowed to fly over people. Now, when you say fly over people, I'm not allowed to deliberately fly over a person. What it means is, if I'm flying in a park where there are people, I'm okay. As long as I don't deliberately put those people at risk. And I take reasonable measures to make sure that, the risk to them stays low. But again, it does not supersede privacy laws. And as soon as you stick a camera on that small drone, regardless of the size, you cannot fly over people. Subcategory A2, you can fly close to people. So only those UAS that are compliant with the subcategory, and we'll talk on other categories in the next slide, can fly close to people. And these are generally drones that are between 500 grams and 2 kilos. 500 grams is just a little bit more than a pound, just to give you an idea. In A2, you have to keep a minimum horizontal distance of 30 meters to uninvolved persons, but it can be reduced to 25 meters if you're flying at low speed. However, to fly, in that scenario, to fly within 25 meters, you do, the pilot does require to have additional certifications, which is all in the regulation. You can go have a look and get certified if that's what you want to do. Seems like a lot of work to be able to fly 5 meters close to people, though. Just saying. And then subcategory A3, far from people. Now, this is probably the most common category that is going to be flown over, and it has to be a minimum horizontal distance of 150 meters from uninvolved people, and that includes residential, commercial, and industrial areas. The downside to A3 is that while it is the least complicated, it's also the most kind of restrictive in terms of where you can fly, certainly here in the UK. Looking around me, there are not many places I can fly my drone, which flies at 20 meters per second, that is 150 meters away from all buildings, whether they're residential, commercial, or industrial, and people. I have found a few spaces, though. I've done a lot of map research. I have found a few spaces, though, but it's probably, for the fixed wing, it's probably the most restrictive. If you're flying a big drone, it's different because you don't need such a big space, so you could use a smaller field. But like I said, it's probably going to be the most common category of operations in the future. Now, so the open category product standards, basically C0, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are all, they're all defined in Cap 722. To go through each one, would probably put you to sleep. But essentially, what we're talking about is C0. These are new categories that are coming out, and from I think it's 1st of January 2023, all drones in the UK must be that are sold in the UK must be marked with one of these categories. Until then, we're in this transition period whereby, like I said, the rules of sub 500 grams, 500 grams to 2 kilos, and then 2 kilos to 25 kilos define, whether you can do A1, A2, or A3. In the future, it's going to be these subcategories, and what you've got is, C0 and C1. These are essentially small. So C0 is like a toy. These are tiny, kind of sub 250 grams, like my trainer. Then it's C1 is below 500 grams, a little bit bigger, and then C2 is a little bit bigger again, or they might have a camera. In which case, even if they're tiny and they've got a camera, they're C2. And essentially, and that defines what you can fly. So, C0, C1, all subcategories, C2, A2, A3 only, and then C3 and the big boys, C4, only A3. So those are coming in. If you're going to buy a drone in the UK, those are coming in, and it's going to be quite quite strict. The downside is, I'll come on to this now. So the downside is that legacy and home-built drones, they're allowed to continue flying, but essentially up until the 31st of December, they follow the categories I showed you before. But after the 31st of December 2022, it's only A3. So you can have, let's say, a Mavic 2, which is the tiny little drone. If it was sold today, it's probably going to be a C0 or C1. But if you have one that you bought today or previously, after after the transition period is over, that's going to be basically A3 only. So this tiny little drone, and the nearest people you can fly it to are going to be 150 meters away. So that's the only downside to this new regulation that I can see. It does suck if you're in that category, but speak to DJI and these other drones manufacturers. They want to keep your customer, they want to keep selling you new stuff. So I'm sure that they're going to start bringing in some kind of trading program like you do with the GoPro cameras. Trade in an old one and you get you get money off the latest one. So speak to DJI, speak to drone manufacturers, explain the situation, and say, look, I've got an old Mavic 2. I want a new one with the new certification, so I can carry on flying it as I do today. What can we do? That's all I can advise on that. So, like I said, you've got the different categories. We've gone over the open category. And so as long as you fly within its requirements, you don't need any additional authorizations. But you do still need to complete the online training and assessment. And depending on the size of your drone, you may have to register to get an operator ID as well. So for my big drone, I definitely need an operator ID. It's not a toy. So I had to do my test. I've got my flying ID or flyer ID. And that's free. Then you get an operator ID, which I think was about 12 or 13 pounds, and it lasts a few years. And both of those IDs need to be on my drone when I'm flying it, or tucked inside on a printed piece of paper. That is, if the drone does crash into something and I run away, they can find me or trace the drone back to me. If you go beyond the restrictions of the open category, then you'll need to go to a specific category approval. And so here, the operational authorization document you get back from the CAA, this is the key thing. And the operator, when applying for it, must outline what it is they want to do, how they will do it, what they will do it with, and then demonstrate that all this can be done safely. What this means is essentially it's a big risk assessment. And so operating in the specific category brings you into the realms of CAA oversight as well. So the steps you are required to maintain this authorization may go beyond, the simple risk assessment. So, for example, if one of the mitigations you've got is that your drone has to be kept in a certain standard, or kept airworthy, and certain things need to be checked. Well, they might say, well, you need to have a register of when you perform that check. Okay, so that if there's ever a problem, or if we want to come and inspect you, we can, and we can see that you're going through that risk assessment. So yeah, and it doesn't matter if you're, a commercial or a recreational operator. If you're operating in this category of approval, you will have to do that. And the aim of that is to ensure that the risk to the public and others in the airspace are not put at an unacceptable level of risk. And again, it's that phrase, unacceptable level of risk, by the operation of a UAS. And the most common outcome of an authorization will probably be what's known as the PDRA, or the Predefined Risk Assessment. And this is a prescriptive set of instructions that must be followed to create a known operation with known and understood risk. So like I said, it's going to be, do these checks before a flight. Is the weather this? Have you gone through that? Have you checked that? Is the space where you're flying this? And essentially, if you are, within the boundaries of X or Y, then it's okay. and that's the intent of that one. Now, the certified category, that's different, and that's provided for provision of certification of the aircraft, the operator, and licensing for the remote pilot. And then also compliance with the related condition and or specifications of all of that. And essentially what you're doing is you're operating in a similar way to a real aircraft. The difference is you basically have a remote pilot instead of one on board. But essentially you're operating probably in the same way as that drone that flew from the Isle of Scilly to the mainland UK with a delivery flight, and that was flying from a commercial airport to a commercial airport. They would have been flying in this category, and they would have been flying as if they were a real aircraft. So you'll become subject to a strict level of certification and authorization similar to a commercial operator, albeit on a smaller scale. So that's something to bear in mind. As a hobbyist, I think that most of us will work in operate in the open category, and a few of us that want to push the boundaries a little might work our way into the specific category. But really certified, you're talking, big buckets of cash here. So that's going to be for the commercial boys only that are doing specific operations that require the certified category. And where can you fly in these categories? Well, okay, so the application of rules essentially for the open category, don't apply in controlled airspace. So that is everything that is not a danger restricted area or a flight restriction zone. Everywhere else is what we call controlled airspace, but those rules of controlled airspace don't apply to drones flying in the open category, so long as you are flying within the restrictions of that category. So if you go beyond that, then you essentially are not just flying without authorization based on the category you're flying in. You're probably also breaking the law. In fact, you are breaking the law because you are flying in controlled airspace without the necessary authorizations. So we really need to bear that in mind. An open category here, like I said, an FRZs, you're not allowed to fly basically because the open category doesn't allow you to do it, and the flight restriction zones apply to the open category. For the other categories, it's all set out in the authorizations. So for the specific category, the operational authorization will say what you can do in the different airspaces that you want to operate in. Remember, one of the questions was where you want to do it. So that will be key for that. And for the certified category, essentially, like I said, you're operating as normal aircraft. So you're going to have to be able to operate that drone to the same standard as a pilot would on board a normal aircraft. Now, I talked about it earlier. So where to fly in the UK? So if you're lucky, you've got a massive amount of private land and you can fly over that with your heart's content because it's your land and nobody else is allowed on it. Many of us don't. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. So my garden is measured in double-digit meters, which is tiny. So there's no way I can fly my drone in my garden. I've got to look out further beyond that. Now, there are parks which haven't introduced bylaws that restrict drones, but again, the regulations apply. So if you're in a park that has people inside of it, guess what? You're going to be careful where you fly. So if you're flying in A3 and you're in a park, you have to be sure that there's nobody within 150 meters of you when you're flying, and everywhere you fly, there is nobody within 150 meters of you. And I would say that is an unrealistic expectation. So I cannot fly my drone in a park where there are bylaws that say I cannot. Where there are bylaws that do not say that I can't fly a drone. If I had a small quadcopter, then yes, I probably could, because I can fly in A1 or A2. And I'm not a fixed wing, so I'm not going at speed. I can control where the drone goes, and I can land quickly if needs be. But from my situation, That's not going to fly. But what we do have is, and this is an ordnance survey map, as you can see here. And for those who are not familiar with them or are not from the UK, what we have are basically the yellows and reds are roads. We've got the blues rivers, the brown the contour lines, which show the relief of the land, and then the black lines are essentially boundaries and fields. These green things are public rights of way, and essentially what we have are basically, so these ones here are like footpaths. So they are a legal right of way that anyone can exercise on foot, and the landowner cannot stop you. They are, they are reimbursed by the local authority to maintain the infrastructure needed in order to maintain that public right of way, but the landowner cannot stop you. The interesting ones are these, and these are bridleways that are open to all traffic, also known as a boat. They are actually called that. I'm not making this up. So this is an old Roman road, hence why it's so straight. And this is not a road. It is basically a track through somebody's field. And if I want to take my truck and drive over that, I'm allowed because the law says I can. What this also means is that this opens up possibilities of where I can take my truck and launch my drone, and then walk in a field to control it. So that's what I'm going to be looking at in terms of, where I'm going to be flying my drone and the space I'm going to be operating in. I've got a couple of sites nearby that I know really well. I know, the kind of traffic we get through there, not very much. And when there are pedestrians, I've got enough space to fly away from them in an area where I'm more than 150 meters away. So I'm really comfortable with that spot that I've chosen. I've got a backup as well. And essentially, so these blue lines are grid lines. That's a square kilometer. And if I'm allowed to fly 500 meters away from where I'm operating from, let's say I was here on this corner, I can't fly over roads and I can't fly over buildings, but I can fly within 150 meters of them. So in theory, I could fly around this area. That's still a bit restricted though, because I've got some buildings here, I've got some buildings there, I've got a road here, and if there are people on these footpaths, I have to avoid them too. So, like I said, I've had to do a lot of searching, but I found some spots where I'm comfortable I can abide by the rules, and the laws. Also, what you've got is, you've got spaces with model flying clubs, and these are spaces that are actually closed to aircraft. So, normal aircraft are not allowed to fly in these areas. They are permanent restriction zones, and they are essentially intended for model aircraft only. They are really good, but they come with their own restrictions as well. The clubs who operate them will often say you have to have certain certifications. I don't have time for that, unfortunately. I'm not going to go down that route just yet. I might do later on this year if I'm still in the UK, but I don't see a benefit in me investing all that time to get a certification I'm not going to be able to use when I move to America, hopefully later this year. And there are flying parks open to the public where they actually say you're allowed to fly drones. Now, there's certain parks in London which actually have a drone field. It's gone the other way where a lot of parks are saying you're not allowed to fly drones here. There are certain parks where they say, well, we know you need some space to be able to do it. So, we'll provide this space for you, which we think is safe. And as long as you fly within these boundaries, you can do so. Now, I could do that, but it's just a bit too small for my drone because of the speed it flies at. But it's possibly, maybe a third choice down the line if I get really desperate. And just like the FAA, we have here in the UK, we've got the Drone Assist app, and that's been developed by the National Air Traffic Service. These are the guys who do all of the air traffic control. And it's a really good app, actually. My only criticism would be that you have to sometimes scroll very close in to a spot to get the full details of restrictions in that area. So if you zoom out and you're looking for a spot, you don't get the full overlay of restrictions that, when you zoom out at a certain level, which has made my job a little bit more difficult to find a spot. But otherwise, that app is excellent. It covers all of your danger areas. So, I've got a lot of military ranges near here, so you don't have to fly over those. Not have to fly over military installations. You don't have to fly over FRZs, aerodromes. They're all on there. It's really good. It's cut and dry, and it's excellent. So if you fly a drone in the UK, make sure you have it on your phone. Where not to fly, like I said, FRZs, regardless of the altitude, you're not allowed to fly inside them. Restricted areas, danger zones, built-up areas without authorization, and a specific risk assessment. Those spaces that would infringe on private space and infringe privacy laws. And in the UK, you're not allowed to operate from a moving vehicle, whereas in the States, if you get a waiver, you can. And of course, not above 120 meters without authorization from being in a specified or certified category. Now, remember as well, if you get authorization under the specific category, that does not automatically mean you're allowed to fly above 120 meters, unless you say in your request that you want to fly above that height. So yeah, just be very wary that you have to be very specific in what you ask for. So enough from me. I'm going to hand over and speak to some guys from the CAA. This is an excellent interview, and I'm really, really thankful that they agreed to help me out and do this interview. So without further ado, we'll hand over.
Hi and welcome. So like I said, we have two guys from the CAA who have very graciously agreed to appear on this episode and to help forward the discussion on drone regulations. So we have Gerry Corbett and Giancarlo Sylvestre. If you both want to take the time, a couple of minutes, to just talk about your role and what you do, and a little bit about yourself. Gerry, if you start with yourself.
Okay, yeah, I'm Gerry Corbett. My actual background is originally from the military. I joined the Royal Navy as a helicopter pilot. Got a little way through the helicopter training, and then I had a car accident, and so some people say I saw the light and stopped flying and became an air traffic controller instead. So the vast majority of my my experience has been air traffic controlling, either from airfields or at sea on carriers, but with levels of safety management type safety work in between as well. My last job in the Navy was on an exchange with the Civil Aviation Authority in the airspace policy section. And traditionally at the time, it was the Navy bloke there was the person that dealt with unmanned aircraft as they were coming in shortly. So shortly after that, I left the Navy and I got a job with the CA and sort of continued my my same role there. My basic role now, though, is I'm what they call a policy specialist, dealing with operations with regard to unmanned aircraft within the unmanned aircraft systems unit at the CAA.
Awesome. I'm former Army myself, so we won't talk about rugby and the Army Navy. Giancarlo.
Yeah. Hi. So Giancarlo Sylvestre here. I work with Gerry in the policy side of the UAS unit at the CA. Been with the CA for a year and a half almost. Very good and challenging times. Happy to be here. Background, airline pilot with Boeing and Airbus experience. I have a master's in safety management, and I joined from that background to the UAS unit, and I managed to, together with Gerry, implement the new regulations last year, which was a major milestone for the CAA. So happy to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I can see why both of you have kind of started working in the UAS section. There's so much development and kind of innovation going on in this space right now, especially here in the UK. I mean, we're seeing stuff going on in Scotland with the NHS drone flights between the remote islands, and then also more commercial deliveries with the Isles of Scilly, with like a drone flight from commercial airport to commercial airport. I I'm not seeing, much of this going on elsewhere, except maybe, in Africa with zipline and a lot of the medical stuff. But it sounds like a really exciting time to be involved in the drone airspace here in the UK.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's one thing. I mean, none of us were, I don't think, ever naturally born to unmanned aircraft operations or anything like that. We sort of fell into it from different ways, and all of us, I think, bring in our previous aviation experience and just modify it slightly to deal with unmanned aircraft. And that's one point I always want to try and get across, really, is that UAS, or remotely piloted aviation, is really just another evolution of aviation, just like propellers, propellers going to jets, prop power going to jet power was, fly-by-wire coming in. You could say Concorde to a certain extent as well was an evolution, but of course they stepped back a bit from that. But it's just an evolution of the same thing. I mean, the basic principle is very much still the same, that we are still moving aeroplanes through the air. It's just the fact that the person that's doing it, or the person that's piloting it, may be in a different location than was traditionally accepted, on board the aircraft itself. So a lot of the basic principles are the same, but the things are the same. As well as that, a lot of people, we would just want to make sure that the same old wheel doesn't get reinvented, and we use the benefits that we get before, but adapt as necessary. And a lot of different countries doing different things, lots of bright ideas happening. One thing you obviously have to counter at times is that sometimes nowadays people think the answer is a drone, and they haven't asked the question yet. Whereas it should be the other way around. Can a drone make the operation a little bit more efficient or safer?
Yeah, absolutely. And so with all this innovation going on, the regulations have to keep up and keep track. So on 31st of December last year, and going into 1st of January this year, the regulations changed. And I've just been through, the kind of headlines of what they mean. But this is my understanding as a bit of a Luddite who's just come into drones. But it feels like that the regulations for the commercial and the recreational sector were separate and were brought into one. But can you elaborate on that and the reasons for it?
Yeah, actually, that's probably a bit of a misapprehension. Actually, it wasn't really the case. I mean, traditionally we didn't really have much regulation before. I mean, the expectation was that you'd fit in with manned aviation. But if we go back to first principles, really the first unmanned aircraft were model aircraft, and they've flown around, the person flying in the middle of a field to their entire satisfaction, just visual line of sight flying for that purposes. And that's where within the UK the air navigation order, the national regulations, really built up from there. I mean, originally the regulations were talked about being called small aircraft, and a small aircraft was basically defined as something that was less than 20 kilograms mass, because clearly nobody would fit in there. And there were hardly any other big ones. If there were larger, yeah, that's right. Yeah. And if there were larger aircraft, they were actually large model aircraft.
Yeah.
And so they were flown under similar auspices. And so what we ended up having was a bunch of regulations for small aircraft, which became small unmanned aircraft. 2009, 2010, we adjusted the rules slightly to make them, to refer to them more as unmanned aircraft. But the idea was that anything greater than 20 kilograms was basically regulated as if it was a manned aircraft, or rather the regulations in the air navigation order for manned aviation would apply, but we would then exempt a large amount as necessary. And we were doing that for the large models. You exempt loads of bits, because obviously requirements like the pilot having to be sat at the controls or strapped in and things like that wasn't necessary. So that's where that sort of split happened, really, and that was fine till, as I say, 2010, when nothing really happened. From 2010 onwards, we did see a bit of a change. So we beefed up the sub 20 kilogram regulations, really, because that was the time when we started seeing drones, as you call them, starting to appear, and these were quite big and quite expensive things, but only a few people were using them. So the concept was very much that the majority of people were flying model aircraft for their own recreation fun in the middle of a field on their own or in a club, and not really bothering anybody. The drone side of things, where a bit of technology had come in, and bear in mind that 2010, the iPhone had only really just been invented. It'd only been in for a couple of years since then. So this technology was moving fairly quick. So the concept of something being able to fly more automatically was really coming in, and that's where we saw the potential for people wanting to start flying in towns and cities and flying close to people. And that's really where the requirement was. At the same time, of course, these things were quite expensive. So it was fairly clear that really only commercial people or commercial operators were going to use these, or a few people were going to use them. And so that's where we put the split at the time of if you were a commercial operator, you had to get certain permissions to basically fly and get permission to operate, because those were the people that, unlike a model aircraft, a model flyer again, who basically sits in one place all the time, the commercial operator might be in, I don't know, Cornwall one day, Kent 2 days later, and then up in the north of Scotland days later. And so we wanted a bit of satisfaction that these people could operate and had the right sort of operating principles to go to different locations and operate safely within the air. That principle was fine for a while, but then it all sort of got bashed away a bit really in about 2014, when with the much bigger involvement of people like DJI and people like that, and suddenly cheap, massively available drones were much more available. And that was certainly around the time where I started thinking, well, actually the split between commercial and recreational doesn't really apply. But it's taken a while to get used to that, because everybody was stuck in their minds by then. So I know I've taken a long way of answering that. Actually, there was no difference. The regulations were the same. It was just that there was a slightly bigger requirement on commercial operators to actually register with the CAA for that reason. If you fast forward on now, we get to the point where actually nowadays you get to the point with two relatively small, relatively cheap drones who are quite effective. But if you think of them flying in the same place at the same time, one's being flown recreationally and the other one's being flown commercially, the risk to whatever is around is identical, no matter where you are. So the reason why should this commercial person have to go through loads more hoops, barrel rolls, to actually fly the same aircraft at the same place for the same time? So that's why we, and part of within Europe, while we were still in Europe, but these new regulations were developed under the sort of European banner as well. It was more the concept of what is the risk of the operation, and the risk of the operation doesn't matter whether you're making money from it. And the whole concept of commercial operation was quite a difficult one as well, because the definition was all about if you're getting valuable consideration, mainly money, for the flight, for the purpose of the flight at the time. And there are lots of ways around that. Of course, recreationally, you might have one operation. You might be paid for another flight, but in the middle, for example, something like the CAA, if we flew an aircraft around our own building, that's not a commercial operation because we're doing it ourselves. It's a private operation, and there's no money being transferred for the flight, unless, of course, we got somebody in to do it. So it wasn't really helpful. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. So the regulations were adjusted, and the whole concept, the whole aim was put on what is the risk of the operation, where you're doing it at that specific time. If that sort of fills in the basic idea. So so throughout, the regulations have been the same, but we tried to manage things and just adjust the risk principle a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I as somebody who works in cybersecurity, risk underpins everything we do. So I'm so excited to hear those words, that it all depends on the risk rather than what banner you're doing something under. There's such a refreshing way of a regulator looking at an issue. And I suppose as well, like you said, in 2010 there were fewer drones around because they were they were only available to those pockets for it. And as they come down in price, like smartphones, they become more popular. So whilst the impact stays the same, the likelihood goes up, and that changes the risk, and you have to do something.
Exactly. And one of the other things as well is that at the time, on the previous regulations, we put quite a lot of emphasis on if it was camera fitted, that you had to do this. But the reason for that was really because, again, if you go back 10, 15 years, the cameras that you're using were sort of the big digital SLRs, really. They weren't the cameras that fit in phone there. It's a digital SLR. So it's a big camera, so that you need a big drone to carry it. And it's obvious that if you're going to fly close to people or property to take a picture, then the risk is going to be greater. again, you fast forward on a few years, and you can get things that fit in my hand now. You can get two sometimes that fit in my hand, two small drones with cameras on as well. But the and the regulations have got a bit out of kilter because the requirement of something that fitted in my hand, you had to go to the CAA if you wanted to fly in my back garden, for example, if it had a camera on it. But if it didn't have a camera on, it could be 19.5 kilograms, and I could take it out of my garden, hop it over the wall, and fly it down the street. And as long as I didn't endanger people, that was legal. So the whole risk element and the principles were completely out. I think a lot of people at the time thought that the camera fitted bit was about security or about privacy, but it was actually about safety. The logic being, if you want to take a photo of something, you've got to get close to it. But again, that's why we've tried to adjust things now with the new regulations, where if it's small, even if it's got a camera on, yes, you might have to register yourself as an operator, but that's mainly privacy type security elements as much as anything. But that doesn't stop you flying in an area where you can do relatively little harm because the aircraft is small and it won't hurt. But if it's a big aircraft, whether or not it's got a camera on it, restrictions are elsewhere. So that's, again, it's trying to be proportionate and trying to balance off what happened. What we did at the time 10 years ago was entirely right, but of course the world has developed a lot since then.
Absolutely. Just on that question of size, and I want to bring weight into it. So you talk about the weight limits, and obviously the new regulations specify that as well. Where do foam aircraft, fixed wing aircraft, fit into that? Because, for example, the drone I'm building has a 2-meter wingspan. It's foam with a little bit of wood in it, but even with the batteries on board, with really big batteries that would give it an hour or two flight time, I'm still under 4 kilos.
Yeah.
For a fixed wing that's 2 meters wide, that's wider than I am tall. And I'm flat. Now obviously the motors and the propellers that can fit onto that are powerful, and those propellers can do some serious damage. But like I said, the whole thing is less than 4 kilograms. So that would be interesting to get your view on that. Vis-a-vis, like you said, the size versus weight versus risk.
Yeah. The thing, I mean, there's always a thing to watch about weight because of speed and things like that. Because of course, I could say a bullet weighs a few grams, but it will kill you. Where I could mildly squash you with a ton of feathers, and it wouldn't really matter that much. And so again, I suppose it's size and everything. It's how you use it. And forgive me for saying that sort of thing. But I mean, it's one of those sort of scales that increases quite rapidly in terms of mass, and so that's why generally throughout the world they've sort of settled on the 250 grams, which is roughly the size of a pack of butter. Anything of less than that mass, that weight, generally is considered to be, I won't say harmless, but I'll say low risk in terms of things that it's extremely unlikely to hit you. Clearly, if it goes incredibly fast, then it would, but within the normal limits of what happening, anything below 250 grams, we don't really get too worried about. Then as you get over that, there's a bit of a sliding scale, but then from anything beyond that, otherwise, that it's recognized that sort of weight will start to hurt people. And clearly, whilst the upper limit of the open category is under 25 kilograms, actually, when you get something that big, that's going to be pretty big anyway. But I suppose I could equate it in a little way to that size much well before that, probably 4 or 5 kilograms, something like that. Stand fast what you said about your aircraft being foam, so there's clearly a lot of aerodynamic restrictions and that in there as well, but something that big will start to hurt you fairly quickly, and then actually just by adding weight on top of that just hurts you a little bit more, or and you get to a point. So there's a fairly gradual scale from about 250 grams, and then it rockets, and the risk is rockets pretty quickly, and then it doesn't become much bigger after that. So that's why the main concept of, in general, in terms of being able to operate close to people, it is down in the sort of low sub 250 gram area. There are for the new regulations, for one thing I don't know if you're aware of, the idea of the new regulations ultimately will be that the drones sold in the open category, or for the open category, will be part of product standards.
Yes.
a little bit like the old CE marking type process, but they will be built to set product standards, and they will be put in different classes. And depending on that class will allow you what to do. It's actually one of those things that as a user, it's easier to explain, it's easier to understand than it is for a regulator to try and explain it, because we try to cover the whole area. The basic concept is you buy your drone, you turn it over, it's got a number on it. You look at the rules for that number and you fly it accordingly. But at the lower end of the scale, obviously the small things, less than 250 grams, we don't worry about. There is a ban then from 250 up to 900 grams, which is called the C1 class.
That's right.
But the idea is within that, whilst the weight is greater, it's the way they are made is such that have been made in a way that they will protect people. So, you know, the materials they're made and that sort of thing. So something, like I said, like my ton of feathers, it can be incredibly big and heavy, but it won't necessarily hurt you because it's a bit more squashy and it's more people are less vulnerable. And then beyond that, there's also the C2 category, which goes basically from anything sort of 250 grams up to 4 kilograms potentially. But for that, again, the idea is that to comply with the standard and to get that C2 marking, the aircraft will have to be built in such a way that, you know, they can show it is relatively low risk to people, and, you know, and controllable, and you won't fly it too close to people. So you can make something heavier as long as you can, as the manufacturer can demonstrate that it still isn't very risky. Similarly for you, your sort of thing, if you really wanted to fly that sort of your model that you make close to people, then you'd need to sort of demonstrate to us that, oh, it's relatively harm-free, even though it's bigger and heavier. But clearly, I think with a fixed wing type thing, you're going to want to operate it far away from, you know, in clearer areas anyway, because of what you're doing. So it's
certainly far away from the ground.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all about the risk. Again, it's about the risk, and the concentration now is on the risk you present to people, as opposed to before we talked about buildings and things like that. I mean, the concept in many ways for some stuff is that insurance will cover that sort of thing, but generally we're talking about people. But of course, if the people are in a building, then if they're in a greenhouse, for example, then clearly there is still quite a risk to those people. But if they're in a fairly solid building, it's perhaps not so risky. And obviously people in vehicles as well, you still got to keep away from the person in the vehicle, because if you get too close to them, you could cause an accident that way. So that's the basic principle for that. So the weight does vary, but I think you get up fairly quickly. And to be honest, nowadays I think the push is to make things smaller as much as anything. And the smaller you make things, the less we really need to worry about it, because they're less risky. And so it's a win for everybody, hopefully.
One thing that really stuck out to me in the new regulations, when I say the new regulations, I really mean the regulations, because it was the first time I'd read any regulations about drones. Because before that I'd been on commercial aircraft. But the one thing that stuck out to me really was this kind of doorway, really, for drone operators, you know, recreational drone operators, I mean, to work out the possible to operate outside of normal operations, you know. So, you know, so it basically had a pathway that we could come to you as the regulator and say, I want to do something that's not covered by the current regs, and, you know, I've done a risk assessment. Can you evaluate it and give me, you know, some kind of approval? Could you go through the steps of what that would entail for a hobbyist like myself, and whether it's realistically possible for someone like me to take my fixed wing, for example, and then start doing flights where I'm going either, you know, EV loss, so extended visual line of sight, or beyond visual line of sight operations, like a commercial operator might, like I've seen happening on, you know, with Zipwire and what have you. Up in various parts of the UK.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I will again. I'll start to say that obviously you're new to things, but whilst it's in these regulations, the capability was always in the older regulations as well. It was just worded slightly differently. It said you mustn't do this unless in accordance with the permission issued by the CAA. And so, with the permission, we said, right, you know, that then said, well, we to grant the position, the permission. We want you to do this, this, and this. And actually, we did the same process, and that was the same for aircrafts that are greater than 25 kilograms as well, where the air navigation order applies. The simple thing was, tell us what you want to do, where you want to do it, how you want to do it, what you want to do it with, and demonstrate to us that it's safe enough. And I'll say safe enough because nothing is perfectly safe. You know, airliners aren't perfectly safe. They are safe enough, and there's different levels of that depending on where you're operating. So the principle has been the same throughout. And in fact, I'll put a bit of a thing for the UK here, that the principle that the UK was using is what basically the Europeans, you know, in the new regulation adopted and took on themselves. It was that principle of you either have a set bunch of regulations which you just apply rigidly to these, which is the open category. At the far end, we certify everything, and in the middle, there's an element where we will assess the safety risk of what you're doing and then go from there. So so the opportunity has always been there to doing it. Again, there's no difference between commercial and recreational. Clearly, I would suggest that in most cases, the commercial driver to do a commercial job or a commercial development or something is probably a bigger driver than the hobbyist, to be honest, because in general, the hobbyist aeroplane model aircraft flyer or whatever is really, apart from the joy and perhaps in some cases the pain of making it and then repairing it when you crash it.
Yeah, don't talk to me about that.
Yeah, the key element for a recreational flyer is actually seeing the aircraft, is the joy of seeing it. So in most cases, I think that the limitations of the open category and what you need should be sufficient for you. You know, if you're going into the stage where you want to fly the aircraft, you know, I mean, it's a little bit different to private pilots, you know, in general aviation, where clearly you get in the aircraft and you fly it for fun. But generally, flying an unmanned aircraft where you can't see it, there's not really the fun involved. I know you can get the first person view type goggle type operation, but again, you can do that. The regulations do allow a portion of that with you stood with an observer doing that sort of thing as well, as long as your observer can see the aircraft and conduct the lookout. But the capability is there. So if you needed to go, let's say, above 400 feet, because 400 feet has become a general sort of cap, then you need to apply with us, give us a safety case, tell us what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and go from there. Similarly, for anything other than a rudimentary first person view extended visual line of sight operation, which extended visual line of sight is probably a bit of a misnomer in some respects, because the regulations either say you're visual line of sight or you're beyond visual line of sight, because it's the pilot that's looking at the aircraft. But we all know what we mean when we talk about extended visual line of sight. It's using additional observers. So yeah, you can do it. Essentially, you have to follow the same safety case process and come to the CA to do it. The trouble with that, of course, is, to be honest, whether you're a recreational operator or a commercial operator, there's still an element of research and consideration you've got to do there. I suppose the biggest other problem for that is, of course, that we charge for our services, but that's because the CAA is we're built up on a charging sort of basis. We're not the government, so some elements we get from DFT, but the vast majority we recover through our fees and charges. So obviously, if we take time to assess something, we have to charge for that time to doing it. So I suppose the only thing I will say there is that if you're going to present something to us, make it as easy as possible for us to say yes.
Yeah.
No, give us the whole information, but don't give us 50 volumes of hundreds of papers to go through and say, oh, it's all in there. You know, something that's nice and combined in 2 or 3 pages with, if necessary, if you want more detail, here's the other 50 documents is much better for us. So we can assess what we need to from there. So again, the principles are the same. You have to apply for an operational authorization if you can't fit in with it. But I think in general terms, the scope of the open category is fairly good for most recreational flyers. One other thing I will add to this is that within the regulations, and because always when we were developing the regulations, we always recognised that the modelers had been around for years and years, had been completely safe and not really bothered us at all. And the new drones had come in. It's a little bit like in skiing, the equivalent of the true skiers and the snowboarders who've come in and sort of mess things up. I'm not a skier myself, but I understand there's a bit of tension.
You might have started a new war on a different front with that comment, but yeah.
That's right, yeah. But that sort of thing. There's always one set of people who've doing something traditionally, and a new bunch come in, and there's the feeling that perhaps it's I won't say mess things up, but taking things over a little bit there.
Yeah.
But within the regulations, when we were developing them, there was a lot of thought about actually cutting models out completely at the start. But when you looked into it, models and unmanned aircraft and everything, it was actually too difficult to do. So the idea was it covers all aircraft, be they models, unmanned aircraft, drones, or whatever. If they've not got a pilot on board, they're covered by these regulations. But then for the true model associations and the true modelers who have been around for a while, there was an element there cut out where they could get a separate authorization, operational authorization, for the model associations. And we've done that as well. In fact, I think we were probably, out of all the European countries, we were probably the first to actually do that. We built it up straight away. So the various UK model associations that are around already, British Model Flying Association, the Scottish equivalent, the Large Model Aircraft Association, and FPV UK, got together, put in a collective risk assessment, a collective sort of safety case, and we've generated a separate operational authorization for them as well. So if they're models, they can do a few other things a little bit on top. So it's one of those things that, rather than spend too much money on a safety case straight away, go and see what perhaps it might be worth joining a model association and taking the benefits of what they do.
Absolutely.
But then again, I would say, it does come back to think about, if you're a model and all right, I want to fly it 5 miles down the road. Well, do you really, for recreational purposes? What fun have you got in that, other than maybe proving you can do it?
Yeah, I
so
do see
that's
people on
something to
YouTube
consider.
doing that
Yeah.
quite a lot.
Yeah.
Not just here in the UK, but in Europe and in the States, where the rules kind of say you shouldn't unless you've got the authorization.
Yeah.
So I suppose it does happen, but it is quite refreshing to kind of almost realize as a newcomer to the hobby, that I can take my home built foam aircraft, and if I get approval, fly it in those kind of missions.
Yeah.
Which
you can do, certainly. You just got to think as, do you really want to do it? And that's something in a way to do. I mean, yes, people do things, but as always in life, whatever you do, be it flying a model aircraft, riding a bike, playing cricket or whatever, you have a bit of a responsibility for what you're doing at the time. So you have to be careful about things. I wouldn't, for example, put a dartboard up on a lamppost in the middle of a busy high street and throw darts at it, because that's clearly not safe because of other things around. But of course, we sit in a pub, or when we were allowed to sit in a pub, and we throw pointy bits at a wall quite happily. But it was a slightly more protected environment. So you've got to think about what you're doing when you're doing it, and ultimately remember, no matter what aviation, whether it's small stuff or large stuff, when you commit something to the air, you are responsible for what you've done, and what it does whilst it's committed into the air until it comes down safely again. So you just got to remember that sort of the basic responsibilities of being a normal human being or a public citizen, really.
That is, probably it. That is the statement, isn't it? And Giancarlo, I don't know if you want to add anything, but if you don't, I think that would just be the perfect comment to finish on, because that really sums it up for me.
Good. Yeah.
So,
yeah. Basically, what Gerry says is true. Just be safe, like any other machine that takes over the air. Yeah, be safe and pretty much good airmanship.
Good airmanship, absolutely. Yeah. I agree with that too. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both ever so much for taking time out of your day to come and speak on the channel, and supporting the village, and obviously, communicating that responsible behaviour message to people in the industry. So I really appreciate your time, and thank you again.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'll just do a couple of quick adverts. We've got some little leaflets. Leaflets. Everything nowadays in the CAA is published under the banner of a CAP, a civil aviation publication. But we've created a number of leaflets CAP 2003 to 2008, and also CAP 2012. They're single page leaflets which explain a lot about what the basic rules are and what you are. CAP 2008, for example, it says it's the new regulations, and it tells you the difference between the new and the old. So if you think you knew what the old were and what the new is, and CAP 2012, just for the open category, gives you a hopefully a simple breakdown of the different categories, the subcategories where you can and can't fly within that as well. But there's always more to that. But you know, we try and keep things as simple as possible at the end of the day. Stay safe, keep it in your sight, and don't be an idiot when you're flying.
Brilliant. I will put links to those documents in the description on the video, so everyone can access it, and I'll put in some others in there as well.
Okay, lovely.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Take care. You know, stay safe.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you so much to Gerry and Giancarlo for that interview. That was excellent. It was better than I could have hoped for. And I actually had to cut it short because I had the feeling that, you know, Gerry is so passionate about the subject, he can talk about it for hours, and I could speak to him and ask questions about it for hours as well. So I hope one day I'll be able to meet up with them in person once we're allowed. You know, go and have a few beers and, you know, grab a burger and just carry on that conversation, because you know, they are, you know, such an interesting topic. If you're into aerospace here in the UK, the drone side is so interesting right now, and these guys are in the thick of it. So I would really like to know more. Anyway, that's enough for this month. Of the next one is going to be in a couple of weeks' time because this one was delayed, and I am sorry about that. I couldn't be avoided. Lots of things going on at work. I'm essentially a one-man security team, plus everything going on with my green card and a few things in real life just got in the way as well. So I apologize for the delay for this month. Sorry, but the next one will be in a couple of weeks' time, and we're actually going to start hacking and getting hands-on and dirty. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll go into the into the Q&A in the Discord channel right now if you want to throw your questions at me, or if you've got any more for the CAA that I can pass on, come and join us, and you know, just come and have some fun. I'll be grabbing a beer, so I hope you will too.